this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the tools that I use when I build miniatures. The first tool you're going to need when you start building miniatures is clippers. And it may seem like all clippers are created equal, but they're not. So let's take a quick look at what I think makes a good clippers and why I use the clippers that I use. I just have a couple options here. This is a bigger clippers. You can get these kind of clippers just about at any hardware store. You can get brand names, you can get off brands. But here we have Citadel Miniatures clippers, but basically Games Workshop's clippers. I predominantly use this clippers, and there's a specific reason for that. Initially, when I started building miniatures, I always went with the cheapest clippers I could find. But as I examined the Games Workshop clippers when I had a chance to take a look at it at my local hobby store, I realized that there is an advantage to these clippers. There are several other brands out there specifically for miniatures or hobbying that are different than these clippers as well. I've looked at those as well, but I do still prefer these. And the biggest reason is the height of the clipper blade, or the angle at which the blade is created. So to demonstrate this, let's take a look at this big one first. So I'm going to hold these up. So what I'm talking about is this angle here, right here, from this surface to this back surface. That angle right there. Because essentially when you look at this, when you're clipping on the sprue, as you clip the part, as you start to close the clippers, if the part is real small and real close to the sprue, it starts to get pushed apart by this. And instead of actually clipping, the clippers is actually just tearing the plastic apart right there. Pulling the plastic, separating it apart like that. So you'll see, this is the clippers I had preferred. The angle here is close. In fact, this might actually have a higher angle. So this smaller clippers actually starts to pull the pieces apart sooner than this bigger clippers. But both of them are difficult to get into a tight spot on a sprue. The reason I prefer the Games Workshop clippers, and you'll see here, is that the angle is much more narrow, much smaller profile here. So this clippers can more easily get into a part. So let me grab a sprue here to just demonstrate. As I put this clippers in here, you can see where the clippers comes together. That's where I want it to clip. But you'll see as I start to clip this part off, that it will actually start, as I'm clipping, it's actually starting to push the plastic apart from the sprue to the head. So let's go ahead and make that clip. And then you'll see I've got a pretty sizable nub left on the head there, okay? Now let's go with this second one. And I'm going to do all the similar heads here. We'll clip them. The second clippers here is the smaller generic clippers. So it fits in a little easier, and it gets tied up against the helmet a little bit better. And you can see that clip I'm making is closer to the helmet, but it is still pushing the plastic apart right there. And again, you're left with a pretty sizable nub still on that helmet. Finally, we'll use the last clippers, which is the Games Workshop clippers. We'll go ahead and use it. And here, we're getting real tight up against the helmet, but it's not doing as much pushing. So now we'll take a look at that. There's much less of a nub left on the top there. So let's put these together here and then show you the results. So there you have the results. You can see that the larger clippers left a larger nub on the top of the head when we were done clipping that one. The smaller clippers, a little bit smaller, and the Games Workshop clippers, the Citadel clippers, almost non-existent. So this is exactly why I prefer the Games Workshop clippers. If you can find another clippers, so the Games Workshop clippers is more pricey for sure. You're definitely paying a premium for these clippers. But if you can find a clippers that has a nice narrow, shallow profile like that of the blades, go for it. That's the kind of clippers you're gonna want. So there you have it. That's the lowdown on the clippers that I use and why I use those clippers. I do still use these larger clippers for other things. These are great for cutting pins, so I'll talk about pinning a little bit later, but pinning I use basically staples, so I still use these bigger clippers to cut staples because they're bigger and stronger and they can cut the staple real cleanly and quickly. So I do still keep these in my arsenal and I do still use them, but primarily for building models and cutting parts off sprues, I do use the Games Workshop clippers. All right, the next tool to talk about is both X-Acto knives or hobby blades, also the Citadel Games Workshop mold line removing tool. So let's talk about a couple things first. The X-Acto knives you're going to use to trim down these nubs. So that's the main part. I typically use a nice sharp blade to get rid of mold lines as well. You can scrape it along the surface. However, if you don't want to work with a sharp knife like that, these are extremely sharp knives and you have to be very careful when you're working with these. So just, I'll preface that. I've cut myself many times. Almost anyone that's worked with these blades has cut themselves. And so it takes practice and it takes careful execution of whatever you're doing to make sure you don't hurt yourself. You can hurt yourself extremely badly with these knives. So I'll go ahead and preface that. But I do use them to remove mold lines. This, however, is not dangerous, not nearly as dangerous. So if you look closely, it's just an extruded piece of metal that you can use it to scrape mold lines off plastic. Plastic is soft enough. So this works great for removing mold lines. I just tend to work with one tool. So when I remove the nub, then I remove I smooth the area of the nub out with the X-Acto knife, and then I go ahead and hit the mold lines all at the same time when I'm working on a part. So I keep one of my blades on my hobby knives like brand new sharp. So I usually try to keep it as sharp as I possibly can, and when it starts to dull down, I move it to a second knife. So this sharp knife I use for all my major cutting. When I need to do magnets or I need to do some kind of larger cuts that would damage, it could possibly damage a blade, working with metal or pewter models, any outside the norm stuff, I use the duller blade for when I don't need the sharp blade. So then my blades have a life cycle. As they get dull, I move them into this knife. This knife's blade usually gets thrown away. And then what I have here is just a couple other examples of hobby knives. You can get colored ones if you want. You can get many different kinds. The nice thing about this one here is that it has a nice cap. So if you want to bring a hobby knife with you, you can cap this up like this and throw it in your bag safely. That's about all there is to really say about those. The next tool I'm going to talk about is tweezers. So there are going to be times when you have tiny little bits that you need to glue on that are hard to reach areas. Tweezers are pretty self-explanatory, right? You just grip the piece that you want to attach in the tweezers as best you can, and you put some glue on it and you put it in there and you glue it. So there's really not much to say about that. There's many different kinds of tweezers you can get. I have a tweezer kit that has many different sizes of these kind of tweezers. I like these. They have a very fine tip. These are your standard drugstore tweezers. Their tip is not as fine, but they do grip a little bit better. So it's gonna be a trade-off on how the tips work. I don't use them a whole lot when I build models, but it's still an option that you run into once in a while, and that can be very helpful to glue tiny little pieces in. And one of the last most important things you're going to need when you're building miniatures is glues. I almost exclusively use this extra thin cement now. The reason for that is twofold. So Testors plastic cement had been my go-to. There's the Testors kind in a tube. I don't prefer that. Then there's also the Testors kind that's more runny and liquidy, and that comes in a bottle essentially with a long applicator tube. It's a hard plastic bottle. That can be difficult to squeeze out of the tube, and it works well. It's a gel and it works really well, but it's frustrating to have to continually squeeze the tube for about 25 seconds before you get glue to come out. What I like about this is this stuff it's very, very runny. It's basically a liquid, and it comes with like an applicator brush. So you brush it on the piece you're gonna glue, and then you can glue it. The best thing about this is it's very accurate as far as where you're placing the glue and how much glue you're putting on it. And you don't need a lot. It works the exact same as any other plastic cement. This is just a little more runny and a little easier to apply. You go through it a little quicker, but I think the trade-off is well worth it. So I recommend the extra thin cement when I'm building models. There are reasons to use the other ones, and people do have good luck with the other ones. So experiment, see what you like best, but I do recommend the extra thin cement. And finally, one last piece I'm going to talk about real quick is a pin vise, is what this is called. You might see it called as a hobby drill, but you're going to find the most luck searching for this as a pin vise. Local hobby stores are very hit and miss as to whether or not they're going to have pin vices or even know what a pin vise is. Hobby stores might be a little better, but you can definitely find this online, many different places. So the idea here is essentially what you're doing is you're holding drill bits in this thing. If you're unfamiliar with what pinning is, plastic models don't require it usually because you're gluing plastic model to a plastic base for the most part. If you have resin models, you're going to do pinning, one, for building the models, and two, just to hold the models to the base, because plastic glue will not work. It's super glue. When you glue a flat surface to another flat surface, any kind of shearing force that hits it will break it right off really super easily. So what a pin allows you to do is you drill a hole in the foot usually. You put your pin in there, which is usually a piece of paper clip, and then put some super glue on it. You drill a hole, same kind of hole in the base that you're using, plastic or resin, doesn't matter, and then put some more super glue on the foot and on the pin, and you pin it in. Then when shearing force hits it, the pin holds it steady and the super glue keeps it on there, so that won't shear the super glue off. And then this pin vise will hold all the way up to huge sizes like this, and the reason for these huge sizes is if you magnetize. You can get drill bits that are the same circumference as magnets. So then all you have to do is drill a little bit of a hole with the pin vise, and the magnet will sit right in there, and you can drill deep enough to get it flush, and you can have flush magnets, you can have them slightly raised. So that's the best way to magnetize, is using these little drill bits to drill a hole exact same size as the magnet. So last thing, again, super glue. There's a couple different kinds you can get. There's many different kinds you can get. I prefer a gap filling medium gel type super glue, which this is my go-to right here, is this Bob Smith Industries Instacure Plus CA glue, it's often referred to, but essentially it's super glue. The only thing you want to be careful with is you never want to use this on any kind of foam. It will eat the foam, it will melt it. But otherwise, for the most part, resin models, metal models, you're going to use super glue on for the most part. Usually you don't need to use super glue on plastic models, but you could potentially use it to glue plastic models to resin bases. So there's that sort of use as well. But there's many different kinds of super glue. Use the ones you like. I do recommend this one. And it's gap filling, so what's good about that is you can pile a lot of it in there, and as it dries, it will actually dry solid in like a crevice or crease to fill it in. And then when you prime over the top of it, you won't be able to tell. You can use a little sandpaper. That's one last piece that I don't have with me, is some sandpaper. But that can come into finishing models, which we'll do a separate video on finishing models. That includes gap filling, sanding, and just prepping, sometimes washing resin and prepping for paint. So that's all I've got to talk about as far as the build video. So if you guys have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, thanks for watching the video. For live interactive tutorials, follow PittsPilot and subscribe on Twitch. For weekly content, including tutorials, tips, and gaming videos, click subscribe here on YouTube. And if you want to see more examples of my work, you can always follow me on social media. Thanks for watching.